All right. Well, good morning. So if you look at the program, it says overview of previous work. So what that means is that Dave here asked me to take a look at a blast from the past. So I started with the title slide. These are actually our pictures back in the day when the first project was started in 2014. So I had a little bit more hair, look a little bit younger. I had a little bit more of ambitious in terms of the project that we undertook at that time. And so I'm going to show some previous results. We're going to look at the past, and then Luis is going to propel us forward and move into the future to see where we were with this project, what have we accomplished from the economic standpoint, and what are the next steps for us to do. Hopefully we get some ideas, some input from you as we go along. So this has been a very interesting project for us to be involved with, learn a lot as economists. In many respects, we feel a little bit like fish out of water, and we're learning and trying to understand. And so hopefully, I know this is going to be slightly different to what you will be seeing the rest of the meeting. And so if you have any questions, feel free to stop me at any time, ask any questions or any comments, suggestions, or anything that you have in mind, the things that we can try to address or things that we might undertake in the future. So this has been a collaborative work with my dear friend and colleague, Luis Rivera, another good friend, Charlie, and a good friend, Dave. We've been thinking about Rose Rosette from an economic standpoint, and the economics component was divided into three different aspects. The first one was the consumer preferences and the consumer behavior. Do people actually see any damage to roses, and how much do they discount the price they're willing to pay for those? What sort of characteristics do people value in roses? And so that's what we're going to be trying to talk about during this presentation. The other two components are related to placing an economic impact number into how much Rose Rosette costs the rose industry nationally. And so that was the second part of this project. I'm going to talk a little bit less about those, but those results are published, and we have the economic impact estimates. It's a big driver of economic loss nationally, and we have that information available if you want to look at it. The third component is about the actual profitability of roses, and that's the part that Luis is going to be talking about after me. So the approach we try to use in looking at this marketing and economic analysis is trying to use a neuro-marketing or neuroeconomics approach in which we ask people to tell us what they value in roses, but we do it in such a way so that we try to reduce the influence of this difference of what people do when there is money on the line and when there's not. So what people say they're going to do and what we actually do are not necessarily the same thing. If they know they're participating in a rose experiment and we have a bunch of rose enthusiasts in the room, or we're doing it for a particular reason, they might try to inflate the evaluations they provide to try to be nice to us. And so we always try to account for this potential nuisance in trying to implement our experiments. So the first thing that we tried to do in this particular case for this project was to do a few surveys to try to understand what do people value in roses. And once we understand how they value, as economists, we place an economic dollar amount into those values so we can inform breeders. These are the things that people really care for in those roses. This is how much they care. And so that's what I'm going to be presenting to you today. So hopefully that will be informative. In trying to look at this value, there are two different types of attributes that we look into roses. There are some intrinsic characteristics that are part of the product itself. And then there is also these other things that relate to the brand, to the packaging, to the label, things that are not necessarily within the product, but that matter in marketing. So let me tell you about one of my favorite studies that look into why do these things matter. In this study, Plasman and her colleagues brought a group of people into the lab. It was not a rose study. It was a study with wine. How many of you like wine? It's kind of related in a way, right? And the disease is also present in wine. So they brought this group of people into the lab, and they gave them wine to taste. It was two different bottles of wine. Here's the catch. The two bottles were identical. It was the exact same harvest, same everything. But the two bottles had a different price at the top. One of the bottles was priced at $90. The other one was priced at $10. Now, when they asked people, which bottle do you think it tastes better? What do you think people said? Do you think they were persuaded by the price? Do you think they were influenced by the price? Yes, they were. Everybody, not everybody, but in general, on average, people like more the wine from the $90 bottle of wine compared to the $10 bottle of wine. Now, what these researchers did next is that they put these individuals through an fMRI machine so they can look at their brain activity when they were drinking the wine. And that's when the interesting stuff started showing up. What happened was that when individuals tasted the $90 bottle of wine, the medial orbitofrontal cortex, which is the region of the brain behind our eyes, activated more with the $90 bottle of wine compared to the $10 bottle of wine. Now, why is that region important? That's the part of our brains that processes the pleasure that we get when we smell and we taste something pleasant. So wait a minute, it's the exact same bottle of wine. How is it possible that we have a different activation? And once you activate that pleasure area in the brain, people actually enjoy the wine more. So there's no perception anymore. It was a reality. Because after that, we got all the pleasure from consuming that wine. Now, that study is very relevant for us because it tells us two things. Number one, we human beings are microbiologically wired to derive pleasure when we consume things that we think are prestigious, that are more expensive, that are branded. But perhaps more importantly for us is the fact that things that are non-physical, non-intrinsic attributes of the product matter in how much we enjoy a product, whether it's a food product or something else. So these other things, we can't really emphasize enough how much these things matter in terms of what people perceive and how much they enjoy and want to buy those products. So it is very important for us because we control all of those things. Now, perhaps for us in this room, we are more interested in looking at those intrinsic values because those are the things that we tend to breed and not necessarily on the marketing dimension. But both of these things are fairly important for the consumer. So there are things that we do almost unconsciously when we decide to buy something. So I have two little boys, and sometimes they make things that they do things that they're not necessarily optimal, or that you probably go back and say, really? And then I ask them, why did you do this? And they just look at me and say, I don't know. Well, this happens to us in many cases. We go around doing things almost in automatic mode. Now, this is important because in many cases, the actions that we take when we're in this automatic mode, we don't necessarily know why. Our bodies are telling a story when we're trying to decide whether we like something or not. Our pupils dilate, our muscles tense, we get a little bit excited, and our temperature rises a little bit, our blood pressure increases. These are the things in neuroeconomics that we really try to measure. So we let the bodies tell us the story of how much people are liking something. We can ask them, but they might be inaccurate. So we do a combination of them. So it's not the one is a substitute for the other. And in many cases, people are not only driven by money. There are many other factors that influence what we do. Okay? There's this concept that we use in economics about people are not rational. I argue there are many different ways that we can define rationality, and the fact that we care about other people and we care about the well-being of other people is fantastic. And we, in many cases, see that not everything is driven by monetary incentives, okay? There are many other things emotionally that make people engage with certain products, okay? So what we did in this particular project was to try to combine the methods that we normally use with some of these neurophysiological responses to try to understand that behavior, okay? So we have devices that will track brain activity. We have devices that look at what drives the attention of people when they're looking at something. And that's what we use in this particular case. We use eye tracking. I think we use facial expressions, but we can also look at other things that their body responds to try to paint a full picture representation of what we do. So another study that we did that was pretty interesting, that essentially look at experts versus non-experts. And this is what we're trying to do here. We're trying to inform breeders and those working in this room. What is it that the consumer wants? Can we bridge that gap? And can we guide some of the breeding programs in terms of trying to understand what drives the consumers into action? This is very important. There's an emerging, pretty cool literature in economics that compares experts versus non-experts. There is some literature in finance, for example, that very perhaps not so enthusiastically. Business students do not do relatively bad compared to professionals when you look at stock market selections, which is a little bit depressing if you pay a lot of money or a lot of the royalties to people who are managing your money. But this emerging literature in economics is fascinating because in many cases, when we are experts on a subject matter, it's difficult for us to try to imagine what other non-experts do. So let me give you an example of an experiment we did around this time when we started this project. We were working with the Society for American Florists. We're looking at what are the drivers that make people buy arrangements. And at the time, there was one comment that they were making about focal plants or focal flowers in an arrangement and how important they are when you have a centerpiece or a central species in the arrangement, how that can make a big difference. And so what they were saying is that they were bringing this plant that was flown by air all the way to the florist so they can have this very expensive, it was around $12 plant to put on this as a central piece within this arrangement. So the natural question we had is like, okay, that's a very expensive plant that makes the entire arrangement very expensive. Do you think that the consumer will value it? And they said, of course. This is such a beautiful, such a rare plant that people are going to value it. So this is the experiment we ran. So there was a convention in town with florists. And so we ran this experiment looking at how beautiful do you think these arrangements are? How much will you pay? So we allow people to tell us how much they're willing to pay for the arrangements. And we compare the responses from experts who were florists, and then we brought real consumers. And this is what we did. So we did two different arrangements, one with expensive flour, and then another one where we substitute that flour with a local flour that was similar in color and shape. And we presented people with the two arrangements. When we did these two arrangements, the experts recognized the expensive species, and they said this arrangement is much more beautiful. The rankings were off the charts for the one that had the expensive species. There was a huge difference in the willingness to pay, around $8 for that very expensive arrangement. What do you think happened when we showed the two arrangements to consumers? Nothing. Exactly. The consumers were not able to tell the difference. The flower looked similar in shape. It was similar in color and in size. So to them, the two arrangements were not statistically different in terms of how beautiful they were. They ranked them exactly the same. When they look at the willingness to pay, there was no difference in the willingness to pay. And so this is an example of why, when we started thinking about this, is, okay, we know what we think the consumer is looking for, but if we're going to inform this project over the next 5 years, we really need to understand what is it that they truly value. So here you can get at least a glimpse of some of the things that we can do at the lab. And Luis, Charlie, and I were the founders of the lab. What we did in this particular experiment is to trying to look at the different rose attributes. And we look at the main attributes that we thought at the time we could influence in terms of breeding programs. So we look at bloom size, and people will receive a combination of these attributes, and they will choose in a menu which of these products they will purchase that differ in these attributes, okay? This is called a choice experiment. I'm going to show you an example of what a choice set looks like. But so we have bloom size, whether the roses are heat tolerant, drought tolerant, disease resistant, and the amount of foliage coverage and the price, okay? So at the end of the day, what we're going to do is to put a number to each one of those characteristics to see how much more people are willing to pay to have a heat tolerant rose, a drought tolerant, and so on and so forth. So this is an example of one of the choices. So you can see here, people have the option of choosing the one on the left, the one on the right. So they see a price and they see a description of each one of these products that differs on those attributes. They can choose either the product on the left, the product on the right, or neither one of the products. And while they were doing that, we look at the movement of their eyes to see, are there certain things that they might look into, them they might want to emphasize, or the things that they're not looking at. Not surprisingly, like you see, they look at the plan, they decide if they like it or not, but then they start reading the description of each one of those attributes to see what sort of characteristics the plan has. And here's an example of a subject that looked with the eye tracking. You will see there's a little yellow circle. So the bigger the circle, it means that the more time they spend looking at that fixation, and they will start moving. And every time they stop looking at something, there will be another circle. Of course, this is like the live view. Then we get the actual numbers, and that's what we work with in terms of doing the analysis. So you can see here how the eyes are moving. They go and they compare. This is done in the lab, but we can actually do the same thing in a real world garden center, for example, where people can look at the different plants and we can observe what are the things that are driving their attention and so on. One of the things that we use that is relatively inexpensive to try to assess whether people are paying attention or are they just going to the experiment without paying too much attention. Sometimes this will simulate some consumers that you might see in garden centers. It's something that we call a cognitive reflection test. This is what is designed to make people think, because if they just go and give you the first thing that comes to their mouth, to their mind, that will give you the wrong answer. So we want to make sure that people are deliberately thinking carefully about the test. So these are 3 questions. Let's see if you guys are awake. Okay, there's a lake, and in this lake, there is a patch of lily pads. Every day, the patch doubles in size. It takes 48 days for the patch to cover the entire lake. How long will it take for the patch to cover half of the lake? Everybody's awake. Most people that are not paying attention will say, oh, 24 days, right? It's 47 days because it doubles in size every day. So this question is very simple. There are 3 questions like that. So, and this shows the proportion of people who got none of the questions right. Some people that got 1 question right, 2 questions, and 3 questions. Why is this important? Because we want to be able to separate those respondents who are really engaged, really paying attention. Sometimes we might get customers that are really into reading the labels and doing everything, but sometimes we might get people who just goes there and don't really pay attention to anything. So we wanted to be able to separate that and look at that reaction. Here are some characteristics. These are real grocery shoppers. So they're not students. They're people who might be interested in purchasing ornamental plants in general, not necessarily particularly roses, but ornamental plants. So we recruit them from the community. This is how much time they spend looking at different aspects of the roses. You can see here there's a marked difference that is statistically different when you look at how long did it take them to look at something for the first time, how long did they look at different attributes of the plant. So there's some difference between these attentive and non-attentive subjects. And here's the most important part. I'm going to show you this graphically, but I'm going to leave this here for a second. These are the average willingness to pay for the different product attributes. So the average price here is about $17.50. And so what this is telling us, if you look at the pool data, is that on average, having a larger coverage, people value that and are willing to pay $5 extra on average. I'm going to show you the full distribution. There's some people who are not willing to pay anything for that. There are people who are willing to pay a little bit more. So this is the average, okay? To having large blooms, people are willing to pay $4.3 extra. Heat tolerance is valued at about $13. Now, this is consumers in Texas, so we know a little bit about heat in Texas, all right? That's not necessarily to say that it would be exactly the same in other states, but that's a remarkable. It's almost, remember, the average price was about $17. So almost that duplicates the amount that people are willing to pay for the heat tolerance. Drought tolerance is almost $8.5. Disease resistance, look at that. It's almost $13 extra that people are willing to pay to have a rose that they will know will be resistant to disease. Now, here are the actual distributions. So on the x-axis, you will see how much people are willing to pay. And there's some people who are not necessarily willing to pay much, but this will give you an idea if you're trying to see sort of like a market share of if you had a rose that was resistant or that had certain characteristics, what will you expect of a market share in terms of your consumers? So this will give you an idea for that. And we have those, if you're interested, the paper is published, and you can look at those graphs for individualized distributions for each one of those. And then the next thing that we did was to look into, based on damages that we were able to quantify. And we did that by going into different locations in different states and try to quantify the potential damage. How much is that in terms of a loss in value from the disease, from rose rosette in general, actually. And then we look into quantifying those into economic numbers in terms of output loss, and also the number of jobs that has created the loss in value added as a result of rose rosette. Now, one of the things that we wanted to do that we thought about, but that didn't really materialize in the next project, was to continue some consumer experiments, but in a more realistic environment, where we will actually go into a rose, either a rose field or into a garden center or anything like that, where we can continue to look at how people look into plants that were potentially damaged, that has certain characteristics that were affected by either insects, pests, disease, or anything like that. So that's what we did in the previous grant, and now Luis is going to tell us where we are in terms of trying to quantify, doing enterprise budgets to try to quantify how much you sell some of those numbers in terms of what is the extra willingness to pay from consumers. Now, the next question is, if people are willing to pay $13 extra to have a rose rosette resistant plant, how much more does it cost to grow that? And do the numbers match in terms of, does it justify the economics of breeding those plants and putting those plants together? So that's what Luis is going to be talking about.